Alvenslishtung was a small village. In fact, it was so small and remote that it was not even recognized as an official settlement by the German government. Few people knew of its existence. Ika had liked that about it. That was the reason he frequently visited the place for supplies or to talk with inhabitants. Today he wished he hadn't been here. His legs dragged along behind him as he was manhandled across the cleared ground. Head lolling slightly to one side, he watched as the 5 little buildings burned with a ferocious green flame. The screams as the last remaining villagers were hunted down made his head pound all the harder. Ika's bitter tears stained his shirt front. The invaders were merciless in their task. No one was safe from them, not even the 5-month-old boy that had been ripped out of a loving mother's arms. He snarled his hatred at his 2 captors. A third man came up beside him and kicked him in the ribs. "You want to growl like a dog? Then I'll treat you like one." A second kick ensured that Ika would remain silent. At the end of the clearing, there were 4 throne-like structures being carried on long poles by men. They sat down their burdens, turned, and groveled, faces down in the dirt. 3 other men from the village were on their knees, a pair of men accompanying each one to keep them in line. The armed men simply bowed their heads at the seated figures. Ika noticed one throne was built grander than the rest. It was larger and more ornate, adorned with jewels and made with expensive-looking timber. In it sat a dark figure. For a moment, he thought it was a shadow until it stood and floated off its seat. Then it began to walk towards the first man in line. It studied him carefully, even leaned down and grabbed its chin to study his face. "Consus," he said simply and moved on to the next in line. The poor man he had studied was dragged to the second throne in line, where a withered creature was waiting. Like a corpse, it looked wrinkled and decayed, mummified even. As the man was placed before the throne, it stood and reached out a hand. A white light gushed out of the poor victim, and he screamed in agony. It lasted only moments, then he slumped to the ground, dead. "Delectamentum," the creature proclaimed in a voice like swirling sand and dust before returning to its seat. As the corpse was flung aside by the 2 retainers, the rest of the captives began to struggle, all except for Ika. He could sense the power within the seemingly decrepit beings and knew resistance was futile. Instead, he bowed his head and prayed, though he also sensed it was far too late for that. "Helios," came the cold voice once again, and the next man was dragged to the last throne in line. The shadowy creature did not even glance down at the third man in line as he passed him. "Sol." Then he stopped before Ika, looking down at him. He felt cold as he stared up in the inky black of its face. No features were discernible. His body felt stiff with horror as he felt the power, the pure evil, and the horrible hunger. Ika could not move as it squatted down before him. "You are what drew us here. We could sense the manna for miles." Despite the horrible dread and evil that surrounded the creature, it had a light and pleasant voice with an accent he did not recognize. As Ika sat motionless, frozen to the spot, the creature reached down and grabbed the necklace from around his throat. The medallion dangling from it showed a tree with sprawling limbs, and the creature studied it curiously. "That would explain it. You are one of the mutts belonging to the Kintasha." It snapped its fingers and the 2 men holding Ika released him and stepped back. The creature lifted up its hand, and pain flooded through Ika's entire body. He wailed in agony as he was slowly lifted into the air. "So tell me, Kintasha, where's the rest of your coven? Tell me, and I'll make your end swift." A small amount of white flowed out of Ika and into the shadow's palm. He screamed even louder until the flow was cut. His head drooped against his chest and he gulped in air as he tried to fight the pain. "Never," he finally managed to gasp. "Oh, never is such a long time, and I'm afraid you are almost out of that." The white flow began again, and it felt as if his very cells were being ripped apart. It was so painful that he could not even manage to scream. He wanted death. He wanted anything now to stop the pain. Anything.